Welcome back to Andersen Acres. Today we're looking at one of those topics that can send a chill through any backyard flock owner's spine: avian influenza, also known as bird flu. But here's a plot twist, at least when it comes to ducks. Not all avian influenza is dramatic or deadly, especially when it comes to our ducks. That said, ducks can play a sneaky role in spreading the virus to other birds, often without showing any symptoms themselves. So if you've got ducks and chickens cohabitating on your homestead, meaning they live together, this one is especially important. In fact, trusted farm sources and scientists and people who study avian influenza will tell you that most strains of the virus cause little to no illness in affected birds. Okay? The vast majority of strains are relatively harmless. They're annoying, but they're not deadly. Highly pathogenic forms, however, can pass through a domestic poultry flock like lightning. Now, ducks often survive, but then they become carriers, infecting chickens and other poultry. You're going to want to ward off this disease with good biosecurity measures. Be especially careful to prevent contact between your flock and wild waterfowl. That is the golden rule. Ducks frequently survive avian influenza, yet they can silently carry and spread it to your whole flock. And that's the beat we're going to build this video around today. So let's dive a little bit deeper. Ducks, especially wild waterfowl like mallards and geese and swans, are natural reservoirs of avian influenza A. That means they can carry it and spread that virus, and often show little or no sign of the illness at all. They may never sicken, and they don't have a high chance of passing from it. Multiple agencies do confirm this. The USDA states wild birds like ducks can carry and spread the virus without any symptoms. The World Organization for Animal Health adds that migratory wild waterfowl are a natural reservoir and play a major role in spreading the virus across large areas. Academic literature even calls wild ducks the Trojan horses of bird flu because they appear healthy while carrying this highly contagious virus that can hit your backyard poultry, your chickens, and your turkeys really hard. So, it's time for a little bit of virus taxonomy, the kind of stuff that sounds terrifying at first but is actually important for clarity, because there's a lot of misinformation about avian flu. So, avian flu viruses fall into two main categories. These categories are very broad, but they are useful for categorizing the strains of the virus. The first one is low pathogenic avian influenza, LPAI. This is often mild and causes no visible illness in many, many birds, including ducks. In fact, these tend to be the strains that ducks carry around most of the time. The problem is the second group of viruses, because the second group of viruses is highly pathogenic avian influenza, or HPAI. And this is the real deal. This is the one that devastates domestic poultry. And confusing the two is actually what leads to a lot of the misinformation. Because a lot of times, if it's LPAI, low pathogenic, people will assume it's the same thing as the high pathogenic. It's not. LP and HP are two entirely different things. LP is mostly survivable. HP is highly deadly. That's the dog's tail. But HP is highly deadly, especially to backyard domestic chickens. Okay? HPAI strains can sweep through your flock like lightning, causing sudden and massive die-offs. And here's where the problem is, because the ducks aren't necessarily getting sick, and if they are getting sick, they're not dying en masse. They're surviving to carry the virus. Okay? Highly pathogenic forms can pass through a domestic poultry flock before you have any idea you have this problem. That's why it's so tricky. Your ducks might be totally fine, and yet the chickens next door could go down fast. and your ducks might be the culprit. So let's walk through how this actually happens on the farm. Infected ducks shed the virus, much like we do when we have the flu. And they can shed it through feces or saliva, respiratory droplets, sneezing basically, viral particles. And they come off the body in a lot of ways. And they get into the water, the feed, the bedding, or shared spaces. This virus is surprisingly hardy. Okay, it can persist in chilled water for like a month, I think, and even survive freezing temperatures for extended period of time. That's why shared water sources between wild ducks and your flock are a big problem. Wild ducks come in, doot 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 doot, in come your ducks later, doot doot doot, uh-oh, now they've got it. So domestic poultry like chickens or turkeys can pick it up simply by drinking the contaminated water, walking through tainted bedding, or via equipment that hasn't been disinfected. Or your ducks could come back to the coop from the pond later that day and bring the virus with them. It's not good. Okay? That's why the USDA Extension Service stresses key biosecurity steps. Keeping poultry separate from wildlife is key. You also want to keep everything clean, quarantine new birds, and avoid equipment sharing, especially when those wild waterfowl are on the move, spring and fall. Now, in plain words, ducks might shrug it off. Chickens won't. Highly pathogenic strains can kill chickens rapidly, and when one bird gets it, it often takes down the whole flock with it, unless you take immediate action. That's not just a worry about animal welfare, it's an economic hit and an emotional gut punch for small scale and backyard owners, because we love our birds. Also, while the risk to humans is low overall, at least as of this recording, it's not zero. Some HPAI strains, like H5N1, have infected mammals, including your cats and your cattle, and very rarely people. So it's just plain smart to minimize any chance of spreading it in our barnyards. Okay? It's not difficult to avoid spreading it. It just takes some biosecurity measures that a heck of a lot of us already follow anyway. So there have been many real outbreaks, and many of these outbreaks are started by some kind of contact with wild waterfowl. Okay? In Texas in 2024, so just last year from the time of this taping, okay, just last year from the time of this taping, migratory ducks were linked to HPAI infections, not just in poultry. Okay? Egg-laying hens, yeah, and that sucked for them because you can lose entire, and remember, there are thousands of egg-laying hens in those large factories. You can lose thousands of birds, tens of thousands of birds overnight. So yeah, I think it was like 1.6 million hens had to be culled. But that wasn't the extent of it. It also was in dairy cows and even one person who experienced mild inflammation. That underscores how these things can cross species, which is a concern. It's not the biggest concern right now, but we always say that. We always say that. We always say it's not a big concern right now. But even beyond crossing the species barrier, you worry about your own birds. You shouldn't panic, okay? And if you have backyard ducks, you just do everything you possibly can to keep them away from the wild ducks. We don't have a problem. We have the livestock guardian dogs. The livestock guardian dogs don't like birds that aren't supposed to be here. They don't let the ducks and the geese hang out in our yard with our ducks. So we don't have a problem. What you should do is try to keep them apart. Try not to let wild ducks and geese hang out with your ducks. And just practice basic biosecurity measures. Okay? Bird hygiene. A lot of us do that anyway. A lot of us have made the mistake of not maintaining proper biosecurity, and then we bring home an illness to our own flock. Not bird flu, but many times over the years. How often has somebody brought a respiratory disease just because they didn't wash their hands after going to someone else's farm? How often have they brought in something because they didn't change their shoes? It happens every day. So of course it could happen with bird flu. So basic biosecurity measures will help you. So what can you actually do when I say biosecurity measures? Because I sometimes feel like that's not enough to say. It's better to give a little bit of detail. Now, remember, everybody's situation is a little different. So how you implement these biosecurity measures um, might vary a little bit. So again, limit the contact your ducks have with wild ducks or wild geese. Keep them in their own run. If you have a lot of waterfowl traveling during migratory seasons, maybe consider getting livestock guardian dogs that can keep the waterfowl that's not supposed to be in your yard out of your yard. That could be a good way to do it. Clean everything. Keep everything clean, right? Keep your runs clean, your feeders, your waters, your waterers. Just make sure everything that could possibly have been exposed to wild birds is clean. And we're supposed to be doing that anyway. It's not even just about bird flu. You are supposed to keep things basically clean. Also, you want to make sure you quarantine newcomers, which we should be doing anyway. Everyone should be quarantining newcomers 30 feet for 30 days. Okay? 30 feet for 30 days allows any illnesses to develop, any symptoms to show up, and whether it's bird flu or something else, allows you to protect the health of your flock. Okay. You also want to try not to let quarantined birds share food and water sources. So if you're quarantining your birds, but they share your pond as a water source, you might have it fenced in, but they're still sharing the water, that's not good. Quarantined birds need to be completely separated. And then just stay vigilant. Watch for signs, not just of bird flu, but just watch and see and pay attention if there is an outbreak in your area. That's the time to kind of double down and make sure you don't have a whole lot of contact with other birds. And remember that ducks, because that's what this video is about, right? Ducks. Ducks can harbor that illness and spread it. They probably will look fine, but they can be that kind of stealth bridge of disease. Being proactive, clean, and observant can help protect your whole flock and your neighbors' flocks. Is this a huge risk? No, not currently. As of this taping, right now, when I'm recording, it is not a huge risk, okay? Could it be next year? Sure. It's not right this second, but it's still worth talking about. So here's the bottom line. Avian influenza doesn't often hurt your ducks, but that's what makes it a little more dangerous if you have ducks and chickens, because your ducks are silent carriers and they can bring that lightning bolt to your chickens. Okay? Nobody wants it. It's not fun, and it's especially if you don't know what's happening, because it tends to happen really, really fast. So I personally only know one backyard chicken keeper who has had to deal with it, and they didn't know until after their flock was dead because it hit so fast and the birds just started dropping over dead. And it wasn't a nice death either. Like, it wasn't like one day they were fine and then they were dead. It was like, you look like you just can't breathe. And before you can figure out what to do about it, they're dead. And it was devastating for her because she's a backyard keeper, lives right on the water. So yes, there was contact with wild waterfowl. Frankly, we live in an area where there's a lot of wild waterfowl. I'm between two very large lakes. So if you're not in an area with a lot of ducks and geese, you probably have relatively low risk. But when the birds are moving, we are at a higher risk than a lot of people. And it was devastating for her because she's a backyard chicken keeper and she loved her birds. She still hasn't restarted her flock. She doesn't want to. And that's, her prerogative. But it's not always your fault. But ducks and geese can be that vector. Okay? Just because your ducks aren't going to get sick doesn't mean your ducks won't give it to your chickens. But the good news is, with strong biosecurity and careful separations and keeping things clean and acting quickly if someone does get sick, all of which you should be doing regardless of avian influenza, you can really keep that bolt from striking in many, many cases. Okay, now it's not entirely preventable, but let's be honest. There's only so much you're going to be able to do when it comes to keeping your birds away from wild birds. Let's be honest, because even people with millions of birds at stake have lost that fight. It's actually easier to protect a backyard flock than it is to protect millions of birds. Because millions of birds, remember, those millions of birds are kept in very tight quarters, right? This is why egg-laying chickens tend to end up in such dire straits, is there's so many in those battery cages. Just Google chicken battery cages or laying hen battery cages, and you will see why it might be problematic if a virus gets in there. And it can take just one wild bird. So it gets in there and it just rips through because the birds are in close quarters. They have nowhere to go. So if you have a backyard flock and they free range a lot and they're not locked up in stuffy conditions, stacked one next to each other and on top of each other, then you may have no issue. And I hope we all have no issue, but every once in a while someone does. So your flock is likely not at risk. But if you have ducks, know that those ducks can transmit it to your chickens. Ducks don't have it naturally, okay? So you hatched a bunch of ducks. They don't have avian influenza. They do not have bird flu. They're not born with it. So if you hatched your own ducks, you got them from a clean location, birds don't have it, probably, unless they had contact with wild birds. So your ducklings don't have avian influenza. They're not born with it. They contract it from wild birds, okay? So I'm not saying don't keep backyard ducks. We have backyard ducks, and we will always have backyard ducks. It's just something to be aware of, and to be aware that they're not necessarily going to get sick, but they could make your chickens sick. And how many of us have chickens with our ducks? I do. And it just is something you need to be aware of. But there's a whole lot of resources out there on avian influenza. Just know that you're probably not at huge risk, but it's still worth being aware. We should all be aware of things that could affect our flock long term. And as far as I know, right now, we are not in the midst of any kind of outbreak. I haven't heard anyway. However, that could change. By the time this video is released, that could have changed. So it is best to look for up-to-date, reliable sources, not your neighbor's friend or somebody who doesn't believe in viruses. Not that. Okay? But actual, real sources. And then it's a judgment call. Should you lock your birds up? I'm in the no camp, because what's worse than birds getting sick wandering around on the grass like ours do? Them getting sick while they're locked up together and can't get away from each other. Your calculation might be different depending on your setup and your birds. But in our case, even when it's circulating, I would rather have them free ranging. And our vet agrees, by the way. It is better to let them free range and have the fresh air and the sunshine than it is to lock them up in our barn all together, stuck together, because I can't guarantee a wild bird's not going to get in the barn. So better to be as healthy as they possibly can in the most natural way possible. That's what we do anyway. But that is about it for me here today at Andersen Acres. Have you ever had to worry about avian influenza? I know some of you live in areas that have had outbreaks. Have you had to take extra steps to keep your flock safe? How did that work out? Probably pretty well for most part, I would assume, because we should all be practicing basic biosecurity anyway. Okay, but I would like to hear your comments about your own personal experiences if you live in an area that has had outbreaks in the past few years. Because, I mean, there have been plenty of outbreaks. Yeah. Anyway, thank you so much for spending some time with me today. We'll see you tomorrow.